Have you ever wondered why you'd rather stay home while the world pushes you to go out? Carl Jung believed your choice is not laziness. It's a profound signal from the unconscious. What if your solitude is the very key to creativity, healing, and becoming your true self? Part 1. The psychological roots of preferring to stay at home. When Carl Jung distinguished between introversion and extraversion, he was not merely describing whether someone liked to attend parties or spend their nights alone with a book. He was pointing toward a much deeper orientation of psychic energy. Jung defined introversion as a natural inward flow of libido, meaning not only sexual drive, but the fundamental life energy of the psyche. For the introverted individual, the primary focus of energy moves inward toward thoughts, images, and internal impressions, rather than outward toward external objects, events, or crowds of people. In modern culture, staying at home is often mislabeled as laziness, antisocial behavior, or even a lack of ambition. But from a Jungian perspective, preferring the home environment is often rooted in the very architecture of the psyche. The home becomes not simply a location, but a symbolic container for inner life. To understand this phenomenon, one has to approach it with the nuance of depth psychology, rather than with shallow cultural stereotypes. The archetype of home as the self. One of Jung's central contributions to psychology was his theory of archetypes, universal symbolic patterns that emerge from the collective unconscious. The image of the home, house, or dwelling is a recurring archetype across cultures. It represents security, rootedness, and, above all, the self, the totality of the conscious and unconscious mind. Dream analysis often reveals the house as a symbol of the dreamer's psyche. The condition of the house, whether it is clean, broken, expansive, or cramped, speaks to the dreamer's internal condition. Jung noticed that when individuals dreamed of entering different rooms, basements, or attics, it reflected an encounter with different layers of consciousness and unconsciousness. To stay at home, then, is not only a literal preference, but also a symbolic choice to remain in closer contact with oneself. People who prefer solitude at home may not even realize that they are unconsciously following an archetypal call, the call to return to the self, to integrate, to find wholeness. Introversion as an energetic necessity. Introversion is not just a personality style. For some, it is an energetic necessity. Imagine psychic energy as a limited budget. An extrovert spends their budget externally on conversations, events, and social gatherings. They recharge by immersing themselves in the external world. For the introvert, however, every external interaction requires expenditure. To attend a party may feel like handing over psychological currency at every moment. They can do it, but it is costly. The home environment, by contrast, does not demand this constant energy payment. At home, the psyche can conserve resources, refocus energy inward, and metabolize the impressions accumulated from the outside world. To prefer to stay at home, then, is not always avoidance. It is often a way of protecting psychic balance. Persona and the relief of shedding masks. Jung described the persona as the social mask every individual wears to navigate collective life. In public, people must act, smile, and perform according to cultural expectations. For some, this mask is lightweight and easy to wear. For others, particularly introverts, it is heavy and suffocating. The act of staying at home allows the individual to take off the mask, to breathe freely, to reclaim authenticity. Consider the difference between a day at the office and an evening at home. In the office, one must play roles: the professional, the agreeable colleague, the competent worker. Each role is necessary, but drains vitality. At home, there is no need to play roles, even if one lives alone. The symbolic act of entering the house is like entering a sacred sanctuary where the persona can finally be set aside. This is why some people feel intense relief when they shut the door behind them. It is not just physical privacy, but psychic liberation. Shadow encounters in the stillness. To stay at home also invites encounters with the shadow, the hidden, often repressed aspects of the psyche. For many, this is uncomfortable, which is why they avoid solitude and fill their lives with constant external stimulation. Yet for others, particularly those attuned to inner life, solitude becomes a necessary space to meet, acknowledge, and work with the shadow. When the television is turned off, the phone set aside, and silence fills the room, the psyche begins to speak. Old wounds rise, forgotten memories surface, and repressed emotions demand recognition. To prefer to stay at home may unconsciously represent a willingness to engage with these difficult inner realities. Though painful, such engagement is a vital part of psychological growth. The influence of culture and misunderstanding. In many cultures, especially Western capitalistic societies, extraversion is celebrated. Success is equated with visibility, networking, and social dominance. Introversion, and by extension staying at home, is pathologized. This cultural bias overlooks the deep psychological value of solitude. Jung argued that modern society suffers from one-sidedness, a dangerous imbalance where only one pole of human nature, extraversion, is valued, while the other, introversion, is dismissed. For the introverted individual, choosing to remain at home is not weakness, but an act of self-preservation against a society that constantly demands outward performance. Home becomes a buffer zone, a psychic womb, where one can resist the overstimulation of the collective. Home is a symbol of safety, and the mother archetype. Another archetypal layer of staying at home is its connection to the mother archetype. The home mirrors the womb, offering protection and nourishment. In myth and folklore, the home often appears as the place of safety one returns to after journeys into the dangerous outside world. For those who feel vulnerable in social situations, the home is not only a house, but an archetypal mother who provides comfort and healing. This does not mean those individuals are regressing into childish dependency. Rather, they are tapping into the universal need for grounding. Just as a child requires the mother's arms before venturing into the unknown, the adult psyche requires the symbolic mother of home to recharge. Solitude as creative ground. One of the paradoxes of preferring to stay at home is that while it appears passive from the outside, it is often the condition for profound inner activity. Many writers, thinkers, and artists produce their best work in solitude. Jung himself spent long hours in Bollingen Tower, his retreat on Lake Zurich, where he built stone structures, carved symbols, and allowed his imagination to flow freely. The home environment serves as a microcosm of Bollingen Tower for the modern person. By choosing to stay inside and shutting out the external noise, one allows the psyche to wander, create, and express itself. What looks like withdrawal may actually be incubation, a gestation period for new insights, creativity, and growth. Staying at home as a mirror of the self's needs. Every choice to stay at home is not the same. Sometimes it reflects fear or avoidance. Sometimes it reflects deep psychological attunement. Jungian analysis encourages us to ask what archetype is activated when one prefers to stay home. Is it the protective mother, the self-demanding integration, the shadow calling for confrontation, or the creative impulse requiring solitude? From this perspective, staying at home is not a singular behavior, but a complex symbolic act that can mean many different things depending on the inner landscape of the individual. What remains constant is that such a choice always points inward. It always directs the psyche back to itself, whether for rest, confrontation, or transformation. Part 2. Staying at home and confronting the shadow. For Jung, the shadow is not a vague metaphor, but one of the most powerful psychic realities within the human being. It represents everything the conscious ego refuses to recognize: repressed desires, hidden impulses, shameful memories, and disowned parts of the personality. To live a psychologically whole life, one must confront, integrate, and reconcile with the shadow rather than deny it. The preference for staying at home often becomes the arena in which this confrontation naturally occurs. The shadow as the unwelcome companion of solitude. When a person stays home alone, distractions diminish. There is no external chatter to mask the inner voices. Without the noise of society, the psyche begins to whisper, and these whispers are not always pleasant. They might be reminders of past mistakes, unresolved conflicts, or latent envy toward others. In Jung's terms, solitude strips away the persona and exposes the individual to what lies beneath the shadow. Many people avoid solitude precisely because they are unwilling to encounter these aspects of themselves. They fill every spare moment with entertainment, social interaction, or busy work, so that the unconscious has no chance to rise to the surface. But for the person who chooses to stay at home willingly, there is often a deeper courage, a readiness, even if unconscious, to sit with the discomfort of the shadow. Dreams and the home as shadow theater. Jung emphasized the importance of dreams in revealing the shadow. Interestingly, people who spend more time at home often report more vivid and frequent dreams. This is not coincidental. The home environment, especially when quiet and free from overstimulation, allows the unconscious to surface. In many dream narratives, the house itself becomes the stage for shadow material. The dreamer may find hidden rooms, dark basements, or threatening intruders inside their home. Each of these images points toward neglected or repressed elements of the psyche. The intruder might be an aspect of the self that the ego has cast away. The basement often represents the layers of the unconscious that hold shame, trauma, or primitive impulses. By staying home, one symbolically and literally creates the conditions to explore these dreamscapes more fully. The double-edged nature of solitude. Staying at home and meeting the shadow is a double-edged sword. On one side, it provides an unparalleled opportunity for psychological integration. On the other, it can become overwhelming, even destructive, if the person lacks the tools to work with what arises. Jung often warned that confrontation with the unconscious should not be attempted recklessly. The psyche has depths that can destabilize the ego. This is why some individuals spiral into depression, anxiety, or compulsive behaviors when they isolate. They are flooded with shadow material without a container strong enough to process it. Others, however, find that solitude deepens their self-awareness. They begin to recognize recurring patterns in their thoughts, confront their repressed anger, or admit desires they have long denied. Shadow projections and the role of withdrawal. When we avoid facing our shadow directly, we often project it onto others. Jung described projection as the unconscious mechanism by which we attribute our unwanted traits to the outside world. For instance, a person who represses their aggression may constantly complain that others are hostile. A person who hides their envy might insist that everyone else is jealous of them. Staying at home interrupts this cycle of projection. Without constant external interaction, the opportunity to project diminishes. Instead of blaming the outside world, the psyche turns inward. The anger, jealousy, or fear has no one to land on. It remains within, demanding recognition. Thus, staying at home becomes a crucible for the individual to reclaim their projections and acknowledge, "This is mine." Case example: the isolated artist. Consider the example of an artist who chooses to work primarily at home. While friends accuse him of being antisocial, what he is truly doing is engaging in a dialogue with his shadow. Each canvas reveals emotions he cannot express in conversation. Alone in his studio, he faces impulses of rage, despair, or desire that society would condemn. Through art, he transforms shadow material into creative expression. This illustrates Jung's belief that the shadow, once confronted, is not merely destructive, but a source of vitality and creativity. Staying at home gives the artist a safe container to metabolize the shadow into something meaningful. The cultural shadow and collective withdrawal. Jung also spoke about the shadow on a collective level. Whole societies repress uncomfortable truths, violence, inequality, exploitation, and then project them onto enemy nations, minority groups, or scapegoats. In moments of crisis, individuals may withdraw into their homes, not only to escape personal shadow material, but also to avoid the overwhelming presence of the cultural shadow. For example, during times of political unrest, pandemics, or social upheaval, many people find solace in retreating home. While outsiders may see this as cowardice, Jungian psychology interprets it differently. The home becomes a symbolic shield against the weight of collective projections. Behind closed doors, the individual can sort through what belongs to them personally versus what belongs to the collective unconscious. Shadow work as a practice at home. In Jungian analysis, shadow work refers to the conscious process of recognizing and integrating repressed aspects of the personality. Staying at home provides the perfect environment for this practice. Techniques include journaling, dream interpretation, active imagination, and meditation. For instance, an individual journaling at home may notice repeated entries filled with bitterness toward colleagues. Upon reflection, they realize that the bitterness is not only about the colleagues, but about their own suppressed competitiveness. Instead of continuing to resent others, they can acknowledge their ambition as part of themselves. In doing so, they reclaim psychic wholeness. Home as a symbolic laboratory for shadow integration. Jung described his retreat at Bollingen Tower as a place where he could live in a more symbolic mode, free from the demands of collective life. Similarly, the modern home, when used intentionally, becomes a laboratory for shadow integration. Each room may carry symbolic meaning. The kitchen, a place of nourishment, might evoke reflections on how one feeds or starves aspects of the psyche. The bedroom, a place of vulnerability, can trigger dreams that reveal sexual or emotional shadow material. By treating the home not just as shelter, but as symbolic space, the individual deepens their confrontation with the shadow. The home becomes an active participant in the individuation process, rather than a passive backdrop. The gift of shadow encounters. While painful, encounters with the shadow are profoundly transformative. Jung argued that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Staying at home is one of the most accessible ways to allow this darkness to surface. The gift of solitude is not peace at first, it is disruption. The person who sits alone at home discovers irritability, boredom, insecurity, and fear. But if they can remain with these experiences, something shifts. What once felt like unbearable loneliness turns into self-knowledge. What once seemed like shame becomes fuel for authenticity. The individual begins to integrate the shadow, and in doing so steps closer to psychological wholeness. Part 3. Solitude is the path to individuation. Individuation, in Jungian psychology, is the central task of human life. It is the gradual process of integrating the conscious and unconscious, balancing opposing forces within the psyche, and becoming a whole individual rather than a fragmented one. To individuate is to live not merely as a persona, nor as a bundle of unconscious impulses, but as a self that harmonizes all parts of the psyche. While social interaction, work, and relationships are important arenas for growth, Jung repeatedly emphasized that solitude is indispensable for individuation. Staying at home and choosing to embrace solitude becomes not an escape from life, but an entry into the very heart of life's psychological mission. The role of solitude in meeting the self. The self, in Jungian terms, is the totality of the psyche. It is larger than the ego, encompassing both conscious and unconscious elements. The ego is the center of consciousness, but the self is the center of the whole psyche. To encounter the self requires quietness, receptivity, and withdrawal from external noise. Solitude at home provides precisely this condition. When one is alone, the ego's constant performance for others falls away. In its absence, the self has space to reveal itself. This is why periods of solitude often coincide with transformative insights, new creative directions, or profound realizations about one's true purpose. The self does not shout over the clamor of society. It whispers in moments of silence. The tension between ego and self. Individuation is never comfortable because it requires a confrontation between the ego and the self. The ego resists, losing control. It wants to maintain its illusions, its defenses, and its habitual roles. Solitude threatens the ego because it deprives it of external validation. At home alone, there are no colleagues to admire your competence, no friends to reinforce your persona, no strangers to mirror your image back at you. In that emptiness, the ego begins to weaken and the self pushes upward. This is why solitude can feel frightening. The ground of identity shifts. Yet, this destabilization is precisely what individuation demands. Without the tension between ego and self, there is no growth. Staying at home, tolerating the silence, becomes a symbolic rehearsal for surrendering ego control and allowing the self to emerge. Individuation as a dialogue with the unconscious. Jung stressed that individuation involves a continuous dialogue with the unconscious. This dialogue occurs in dreams, fantasies, and spontaneous images that arise when the conscious mind is quiet. Solitude at home gives the unconscious permission to speak. A person sitting at their kitchen table, lost in thought, may suddenly recall a childhood memory. Another may find an old emotion rising with no apparent trigger. These moments are not random. They are communications from the unconscious seeking integration. If the person immediately distracts themselves with social media or phone calls, the dialogue is cut off. But if they remain in solitude, writing down the memory or reflecting on the emotion, they allow the unconscious to participate in the individuation process. Active imagination as a home practice. One of Jung's key techniques for fostering this dialogue was active imagination. This practice involves engaging directly with figures or images that arise from the unconscious. A person might visualize a conversation with a dream character, a mythical figure, or even a monster that emerges from within. The goal is not to suppress or rationalize these images, but but to interact with them, treating them as autonomous parts of the psyche. Staying at home is the ideal environment for active imagination. Without interruptions, the individual can sink into a meditative state, allow the unconscious to present its figures, and then record the dialogue through writing, drawing, or even sculpting. Over time, this practice integrates unconscious contents into conscious life, a hallmark of individuation. Solitude versus loneliness. There is a crucial difference between solitude and loneliness. Loneliness is a state of deprivation, a sense that one is cut off from others against one's will. Solitude, on the other hand, is a chosen condition of fullness. It is the willingness to be alone in order to be with oneself. Jung observed that many people confuse the two and avoid solitude because they fear loneliness. Yet in truth, solitude is the fertile ground for individuation, while loneliness is the barren desert of disconnection. Those who prefer staying at home and experience it as solitude rather than loneliness are already in alignment with individuation. They are not running away from others, they are turning toward themselves. This distinction is subtle but vital. It explains why two people can both spend an evening alone at home, but one feels despair while the other feels depth. The role of solitude in integrating opposites. Individuation requires the integration of opposites, masculine and feminine, light and dark, rational and irrational, conscious and unconscious. These opposites cannot be reconciled in the chaos of constant social life. They need the stillness of solitude to come into dialogue. In solitude, a man may realize that his inner feminine voice, the anima, is guiding his creativity. A woman may recognize that her inner masculine, the animus, provides structure and assertiveness. A person may discover that their rational judgments are balanced by irrational intuitions. By staying at home and allowing these inner dialogues to unfold, they move closer to psychological wholeness. Historical and biographical examples. History is full of figures who embrace solitude as the path to individuation. Jung himself spent long stretches in Bohlingen Tower, away from the city, building stone structures and conversing with inner figures. He described this period as essential for his individuation. Similarly, Thoreau retreated to Walden Pond, not simply to escape society, but to discover himself. Countless mystics, monks, and philosophers withdrew from the world to meet their inner worlds. While each culture interprets this differently, spiritual retreat, hermitage, artistic seclusion, the underlying psychology is the same. Individuation unfolds most clearly in solitude. Solitude as preparation for authentic relationship. It might seem paradoxical, but solitude is also the best preparation for authentic relationships. Jung noted that individuals who fail to individuate project their unmet needs onto others. They demand that partners, friends, or colleagues carry the weight of their unlived inner life, leading to dependency, conflict, and disappointment. By staying at home and engaging in solitude, a person learns to meet their own unconscious. They integrate the shadow, converse with inner figures, and strengthen their sense of self. Only then can they approach others without projection, relating to them as they are, rather than as containers for unmet needs. In this way, solitude does not weaken social bonds, it purifies them. The spiritual dimension of solitude. For Jung, individuation was not merely psychological, but also spiritual. The self often reveals itself through symbols of divinity, wholeness, or transcendence. Solitude is the condition in which such symbols arise. Many people report mystical experiences, profound dreams, or archetypal visions during periods of seclusion. These are not hallucinations, but manifestations of the deeper layers of the psyche, aligning with the archetype of the self. Staying at home, one may experience moments of profound stillness, where time seems to stop. In those moments, the individual senses something larger than themselves, a guiding presence, a deep order, a numinous reality. These experiences mark key milestones in individuation. Solitude as resistance to the collective. Modern society constantly pulls individuals outward toward productivity, consumption, and social validation. To choose solitude at home is, in a sense, an act of resistance. It is a refusal to be absorbed entirely by the collective. Jung warned that individuals who lose themselves in the collective never individuate, they remain fragments of the mass psyche. By staying at home and cultivating solitude, one protects the fragile flame of individuality. One resists the pressure to conform, to always perform, to always be on. This resistance is not isolationism, but a necessary step toward becoming a differentiated, authentic self. Part 4. The symbol of the house in the collective unconscious. For Jung, symbols are not decorative metaphors, but living realities that shape human experience across time and culture. Among the most persistent symbols in the collective unconscious is the image of the house. Across dreams, myths, and religious traditions, the house appears as a container for the psyche, a map of the inner world, and a reflection of one's relationship to the self. To prefer staying at home is not only a lifestyle choice, but also a participation in this deep archetypal current. The home is both literal and symbolic, a physical space and a psychic metaphor, simultaneously personal and universal. The house as a symbol of the psyche. Jung often analyzed dreams in which houses appeared. He observed that the structure of the house often mirrored the dreamer's psyche. The upper floors represented conscious awareness, intellectual life, and rational thought. The lower floors, or basements, corresponded to the unconscious, holding forgotten memories, repressed impulses, and archaic layers of the psyche. Attics symbolized lofty ideals, abstract ideas, or spiritual aspirations. In one famous dream of his own, Jung described wandering through a house that seemed to expand downward. At first, he explored familiar, well-lit rooms that resembled his own home, but then he discovered hidden levels beneath the ground, including a Roman cellar and a prehistoric cave. This dream convinced him that the human psyche is stratified, with each level representing deeper layers of consciousness and unconsciousness. From this perspective, the house is not only a dream image, but a universal symbol of the psyche itself. When individuals prefer staying home, they may be unconsciously enacting the archetype of returning to the inner house. Each time they retreat into their physical dwelling, they are symbolically turning inward, revisiting the rooms of their psyche. To sit in the living room is to settle in the space of daily awareness. To descend into the basement is to explore the unconscious. Even routine domestic activities carry symbolic resonance. Cooking may symbolize nourishing neglected aspects of the self. Cleaning may reflect the desire to purify psychic clutter. Rearranging furniture may mirror internal restructuring. What outsiders dismiss as isolation may, in fact, be a sacred ritual of returning home to the self. The collective archetype of shelter. Anthropologically, the house has always symbolized protection. From caves to huts to castles, human beings have built shelters not only for physical survival, but also as psychic containers. The home shields the vulnerable ego from the overwhelming forces of nature and society. In myths, the hero often returns to a house or hut after a dangerous journey, finding safety and renewal before setting out again. Jung would argue that the longing to stay home is not merely personal introversion, but an expression of this collective archetype of shelter. The psyche, exhausted by the demands of modern life, instinctively seeks the womb-like security of the house. This explains why people instinctively long for home during times of stress, travel, or crisis. The archetype of shelter is activated, demanding rest and regeneration. The house and the archetype of the mother. The house is deeply connected to the mother archetype. Like the maternal womb, the house encloses, nurtures, and protects. In myths, the house of the mother often represents the place of origin, where the hero must return to regain strength. To stay at home is in part to reconnect with the archetypal mother, to allow oneself to be contained and cared for by the symbolic feminine. Yet, this connection has two sides. On the positive side, the house as mother provides safety, warmth, and grounding. On the negative side, it can represent regression, dependency, or imprisonment. A person who stays home may either be nourishing their psyche or clinging to safety to avoid growth. Jung emphasized the importance of discerning which dynamic is at play. Haunted houses and the shadow of home. In dreams and folklore, houses are often haunted. Ghosts, hidden rooms, and strange noises symbolize the presence of shadow material within the psyche. To stay at home, particularly for those attuned to inner life, can mean confronting these hauntings. The past lingers in the walls, family trauma echoes in the silence, old identities creep into consciousness. Jung would interpret a haunted house not as a fear of external spirits, but as a symbolic confrontation with the repressed contents of the unconscious. Staying at home gives space for these hauntings to emerge. What at first appears frightening can become an invitation to integrate the shadow and cleanse the psychic house. Collective expressions, myth, religion, and storytelling. Across cultures, the image of the house recurs in myth and religion. In Christianity, the house of God symbolizes divine presence and sanctuary. In Greek mythology, Hestia, goddess of the hearth, embodied the sacredness of the domestic fire. In fairy tales, the house in the woods often serves as the site of initiation, where the hero or heroine must confront danger and discover inner strength. Jung saw these stories not as quaint tales, but as expressions of the collective unconscious. They reveal the universal human experience of the house as more than architecture. It is an archetype of transformation. To enter a house in myth is to enter the psyche. To remain there is to undergo psychic change. Personal homes as archetypal mirrors. On a personal level, the condition of one's physical home often mirrors the psyche. A cluttered, chaotic home may symbolize unresolved inner conflict. A sterile, overly tidy home may reflect repression or rigid defenses. A warm, inviting home may mirror integration and balance. Jungians often encourage clients to observe their relationship with their living space as a reflection of their relationship with themselves. The act of staying at home becomes an opportunity for self-observation. How does one feel in their bedroom? What emotions arise in the kitchen? Are there neglected spaces, closets, attics, basements that one avoids? These neglected spaces often correspond to neglected aspects of the psyche. By engaging with the home environment, one indirectly engages with the inner world. The house is a temple of individuation. Ultimately, the house can be seen as a temple of individuation, just as Jung built Bollingen Tower as a physical embodiment of his inner journey. Each person's home can become a symbolic container for psychological growth. To stay at home consciously is to treat the space as sacred. Every room, every object, every ritual becomes part of the individuation process. For example, arranging a study may symbolize creating mental clarity. Decorating with meaningful symbols may reinforce archetypal connections. Establishing daily rituals at home, morning reflection, evening journaling, turns the house into a living mandala, a space where the psyche is nurtured and integrated. The modern crisis of homelessness and rootlessness. Jung might also connect the archetype of the house to modern crises of homelessness and rootlessness. In an age of constant mobility, many people feel spiritually homeless. Even if they own physical houses, the archetypal need for rootedness is unmet, leading to anxiety, alienation, and disconnection from the self. The widespread preference for staying home in contemporary culture may partly be a response to this crisis, a collective attempt to restore rootedness in a disorienting world. Part 5. Escaping the false persona. In Jungian psychology, the persona is the mask we present to the world. It is the socially constructed identity we wear to meet the expectations of family, colleagues, and society. While necessary for functioning in the external world, the persona is not the totality of who we are. It is a thin surface compared to the depths of the psyche. Jung warned that identifying too strongly with the persona leads to alienation from the self. The preference to stay at home often reflects, consciously or unconsciously, the desire to shed the persona and reconnect with authenticity. The burden of the persona in modern society. In professional life, most people are required to perform roles: the efficient worker, the charismatic leader, the agreeable teammate. In social life, there are further roles: the attractive friend, the dutiful child, the supportive partner. Each of these masks is part of the persona. Individually, they are useful. Collectively, they can become suffocating. When someone stays at home, they temporarily step off the stage. The audience disappears, and with it, the demand for performance. At home, there is no need to maintain the smile, the posture, or the professional tone. The psychological muscles required to hold up the persona can finally relax. This is why people often feel a visceral sense of relief upon closing their front door. The relief is not just physical, it is psychic. Persona as a protective skin. Jung compared the persona to a protective skin. Without it, individuals would be too vulnerable in the world. Imagine walking into a workplace and expressing every raw emotion without filter. The persona shields us from exposure and allows for smooth interaction with others. But just as skin can become overly thick and calloused, the persona can harden into rigidity. The danger arises when people mistake the persona for their true identity. They begin to believe they are only the lawyer, only the mother, only the student, forgetting the vast complexity of their inner world. When this happens, the self is neglected. Staying at home breaks the spell of this identification, alone and away from external demands. Individuals can remember that they are more than their roles. Home as a sanctuary from social theater. Society is a theater, and every interaction is a kind of play. People act in accordance with scripts, costumes, and expectations. Home becomes the backstage area where the actor can remove makeup, strip off the costume, and collapse in exhaustion. The metaphor is not trivial. Many people describe public life as exhausting, precisely because it demands constant acting. In solitude, however, the performance stops. The house becomes a sanctuary where the lines of the script no longer apply. Here one can wear pajamas instead of suits, speak freely instead of carefully, and cry instead of smiling. These small gestures are not trivial, they are acts of authenticity. To stay home is to grant oneself permission to drop the act and to live without the mask. The psychological consequences of over-identifying with the persona. Jung observed that over-identification with the persona often leads to a midlife crisis. When the roles begin to crumble through retirement, children leaving home, or public failure, the individual feels empty. They realize the mask they wore for decades was never their true self. This collapse can lead to depression, anxiety, or even a breakdown. Those who spend time at home, cultivating an inner life, are less vulnerable to this crisis. They already know the persona is only a mask. Their preference for solitude gives them regular opportunities to take it off and reconnect with deeper parts of themselves. Thus, staying at home is not laziness, but a preventative measure against existential collapse. Persona and social media. In the digital age, the persona extends beyond physical social roles into virtual ones. Social media encourages the creation of curated identities: the perfect traveler, the flawless influencer, the always happy family. These online personas are even more rigid than real-life roles because they are frozen in photos and posts, and people live under the pressure to maintain these digital masks constantly. For many, staying at home is also a way of staying away from these demands. Choosing not to broadcast one's life or spending evenings offline becomes an act of rebellion against the tyranny of the digital persona. Jung would interpret this as a healthy withdrawal into authenticity. By resisting the compulsion to project an image, individuals reclaim the right to live imperfectly, privately, and truly. Persona versus the shadow at home. The persona is what society approves. The shadow is what it rejects. At home, when the persona is removed, the shadow emerges. This can be uncomfortable but necessary. A person who appears endlessly polite at work may express anger at home. Someone who plays the role of the competent provider may collapse into vulnerability in private. These expressions are not signs of hypocrisy, but of wholeness. The home provides a safe container for shadow material. Instead of repressing anger or sadness, the individual can feel them without fear of judgment. This is why many people cry only at home or confess secrets only in private diaries. The home is where the false persona dissolves and the fuller self comes forward. Escaping the persona as a step toward individuation. Jung believed individuation required loosening the grip of the persona. While it cannot be abandoned entirely, it remains useful for social functioning. It must not dominate identity. Time at home is one of the simplest ways to weaken the persona's hold. By repeatedly stepping out of public roles, the individual strengthens their relationship with the self. For example, a teacher who is constantly admired by students may begin to believe she is only valuable when teaching. But at home, as she paints in her studio or plays with her children, she remembers other dimensions of herself. These private activities restore balance, ensuring she does not collapse into persona identification. Cultural differences in persona pressure. Different cultures place different levels of pressure on the persona. In collectivist societies, individuals are often expected to sacrifice personal authenticity for social harmony. In capitalist societies, identity is often reduced to productivity and status. In both cases, the persona is inflated. Staying at home allows resistance to these cultural demands. It creates a countercultural space where the individual can breathe outside the suffocating expectations of the collective. The dangers of persona rejection without integration. While escaping the persona is necessary, rejecting it completely is dangerous. People who refuse all roles may become socially isolated, unable to function in collective life. Jung emphasized the importance of balance. The persona must be worn lightly, like a costume one can put on or take off as needed. Home provides the balance point. It is not a rejection of the persona, but a suspension of it. The individual learns flexibility, the ability to act in society without losing authenticity, and the ability to withdraw without collapsing into alienation. Authenticity as psychological nourishment. To live constantly in the persona is like eating only processed food. It may keep you alive, but leaves you malnourished. Authenticity is the psyche's true nourishment. At home in solitude, people nourish themselves with authenticity. They rediscover forgotten interests, express unfiltered emotions, or simply rest without pretense. This nourishment strengthens the self, so that when the individual returns to society, they do so with resilience. They are less dependent on validation, less afraid of judgment, and less enslaved to roles. They can wear the persona without being trapped in it. Part 6. Staying at home as an act of protecting psychic energy. Carl Jung repeatedly emphasized that the psyche is an energetic system. Psychic energy, or libido, in Jungian terms, is not infinite. Just as the body tires after physical exertion, the psyche becomes depleted when overstimulated. The modern world, with its constant noise, social demands, and digital bombardment, consumes enormous amounts of psychic energy. To stay at home is not always a sign of weakness or avoidance. It is often an unconscious act of self-preservation, a way of protecting and replenishing this fragile and essential energy. The economy of psychic energy. Jung understood the psyche as operating according to the principle of energy economy. Every perception, thought, or interaction costs energy. Extroverts spend this energy outwardly, gaining replenishment from external stimulation. Introverts, however, lose energy in external interactions and must replenish it inwardly. Consider the person who attends a crowded party. For the extrovert, the energy flows outward, but is replenished by contact, excitement, and noise. For the introvert, the same event is a constant drain. Every small talk conversation, every laugh, every smile feels like energy being siphoned away. Returning home becomes a necessity, not a luxury, because it is at home where energy can be restored. The social world as an energetic drain. Jung would likely argue that modern life is particularly hostile to psychic balance. Cities are crowded, workplaces demand multitasking, and digital devices bombard individuals with stimuli. The persona must remain activated for long hours, costing energy to maintain. For many, staying at home is the only way to survive this relentless drain. At home, the individual does not need to explain themselves, manage impressions, or process endless external data. Silence, solitude, and familiar surroundings reduce energetic expenditure. In this sense, the home functions as a psychic recharging station. Solitude as an energetic shield. Solitude is not emptiness, but a protective shield. In solitude, the psyche is insulated from external demands. Jung believed that unconscious material needs time and space to process. Without solitude, the unconscious becomes congested, unable to integrate experiences, which leads to exhaustion, irritability, and even neurosis. By staying home, individuals create a protective boundary around their energy. They choose what enters their field of awareness, what they engage with, and how they spend their limited reserves. This conscious or unconscious act of boundary setting is vital for psychological health. Energy loss through projections. One of Jung's key insights was that projections drain psychic energy. When individuals project their disowned qualities onto others, they not only distort reality, but also waste energy sustaining the projection. Social life, full of opportunities for projection, can therefore be energetically exhausting. At home, the opportunities for projection diminish alone. One is forced to reclaim projections, to recognize that what they see in others actually belongs to themselves. Though this may be uncomfortable, it conserves energy in the long run. Energy that was wasted on sustaining projections is redirected inward, fueling creativity, reflection, and healing. The archetype of the fortress. Symbolically, the home can be seen as a fortress. Throughout history, fortresses protected inhabitants from invaders, storms, and chaos. Psychically, the house performs a similar function. It shields the individual from energetic invasion, whether through toxic relationships, overwhelming noise, or societal demands. To stay at home is to retreat behind the walls of this fortress, guarding the precious reserves of psychic energy. Jung would interpret the archetype of the fortress as a collective symbol of protection. People instinctively long for walls, roofs, and boundaries because these structures mirror the psyche's need for containment. In times of stress, individuals retreat not just physically, but symbolically, reaffirming their right to psychic protection. Rest as a revolutionary act. In societies obsessed with productivity, rest is often undervalued or even stigmatized. People feel guilty for staying home, as if worth is measured only by visible output. Jung, however, would argue that rest is not idleness, but a crucial part of the psyche's energy cycle. Without rest, the unconscious cannot integrate experiences, and the ego becomes brittle. Choosing to stay home, therefore, can be seen as a revolutionary act, an assertion that one's energy belongs not to the demands of society, but to the self. By resting, reflecting, and protecting energy, individuals resist the cultural compulsion to burn themselves out in endless activity. Energy protection in relationships. Relationships can be either energizing or draining. Jung noted that psychological types often clash. An introvert paired with an extrovert, for example, can feel chronically depleted by the other's needs. Staying home allows individuals to regulate this dynamic. By withdrawing, they create space to restore energy so they can later return to relationships without resentment or exhaustion. Boundaries are essential here. To say no to a social invitation is not always a rejection of the other, but a protection of oneself. Home becomes the space where one can enforce these boundaries gently but firmly. Creative energy and the home. Protected energy does not simply vanish. It transforms when individuals stay home and conserve psychic energy. They often find themselves drawn toward creative pursuits, writing, painting, music, or contemplation. Jung himself, during his time of inner crisis, withdrew to Bollingen Tower. There, he built stone structures, carved symbols, and engaged in active imagination. These activities were not trivial hobbies, but essential outlets for conserved energy. In this way, staying home does not merely protect energy, but redirects it toward individuation. The shadow side of energy withdrawal. Of course, not all energy protection is healthy. Some individuals stay home, not to replenish, but to avoid life altogether. In such cases, withdrawal can become regression, feeding depression, or stagnation. Jung stressed the importance of balance. Solitude must alternate with engagement, protection with participation. The key is not to hoard energy indefinitely, but to restore it, so it can be used purposefully. When withdrawal becomes endless, the fortress becomes a prison. The home, instead of protecting energy, begins to trap it, leading to inertia. Healthy solitude strengthens the self. Unhealthy isolation weakens it. Discerning the difference is essential. Home rituals as energy practices. Many people unconsciously develop rituals at home that serve to protect and restore energy. Lighting a candle, listening to music, taking a bath, or journaling are not trivial routines, but symbolic acts of psychic renewal. Jungians would interpret these rituals as personal forms of energy hygiene. Just as one washes the body, one must also cleanse the psyche. By creating sacred rituals in the home, individuals transform ordinary solitude into intentional energy practice. Each evening becomes a small retreat, each morning a renewal. Over time, these practices cultivate resilience, ensuring that the psyche is not drained by external life. Part 7. Creativity blossoms in stillness. Creativity for Jung was never simply about producing art, literature, or inventions. It was an expression of the unconscious making itself known through symbols, images, and insights. Jung himself wrote that every act of true creativity emerges from a dialogue between the conscious ego and the deeper layers of the psyche. Yet, this dialogue cannot happen in noise, distraction, or endless social performance. It requires silence. It requires stillness, and often it requires the solitude of home. To stay at home is to create the environment where creativity can blossom like seeds germinating in dark, fertile soil. Silence as fertile ground for imagination. In the silence of solitude, the mind begins to wander, freed from the constant bombardment of external demands. The psyche turns inward and opens itself to imagination. Jung described imagination not as idle fantasy, but as a fundamental function of the psyche, equal in importance to thinking or feeling. At home, in stillness, imagination rises spontaneously. One may suddenly see images, remember stories, or envision possibilities. These are not random mental sparks. They are expressions of the unconscious seeking manifestation. By remaining still, by not fleeing into distraction, the individual gives imagination space to take root. Jung's practice at Bullingdon Tower, perhaps the most vivid example of creativity and stillness, is Jung's own retreat at Bullingdon Tower. After his break with Freud, Jung experienced a deep inner crisis. Rather than drowning himself in external work, he withdrew to solitude. At the tower, he built stone walls with his own hands, carved symbolic figures, and allowed images from his unconscious to surface. He recorded these in the Red Book, a monumental work of art and psychology. Jung was clear: these creative acts were not hobbies, they were essential for his individuation. They represented the unconscious communicating through symbols. Without solitude, without the tower, the Red Book, and much of his later theory might never have emerged. His creativity blossomed precisely because he gave himself over to silence. Creativity as a child of the unconscious. Jung believed that true creativity is never fully conscious. The artist, the thinker, or the inventor often feels as if the work comes through them rather than from them. This sense of inspiration is the unconscious providing symbolic material. Stillness is what allows these unconscious contents to rise to consciousness. At home, away from noise, an individual can listen to this unconscious flow. A melody might appear during a quiet evening. A story might unfold in a dream. or a solution to a problem may suddenly strike while washing dishes. Creativity blossoms in these quiet interludes because the unconscious is finally heard. The archetype of the muse. Across cultures, creativity is personified by the archetype of the muse, a divine figure who whispers inspiration to poets, musicians, and artists. Jung would interpret the muse not as an external goddess, but as an archetypal figure of the unconscious. To encounter the muse requires receptivity, openness, and stillness. The noise of constant social interaction drowns out her voice, but at home, in silence, the muse can speak. Those who prefer solitude often find themselves more creative, not because they are uniquely gifted, but because they provide the conditions for the muse to enter. Their willingness to stay home, to be still, is what opens the door. Stillness versus stagnation. It is important to distinguish between stillness and stagnation. Stagnation is lifelessness, inertia, or avoidance. Stillness, in contrast, is dynamic. It is full of potential energy waiting to be expressed. A seed resting in soil is still, but not stagnant. In time it will sprout. Likewise, a person in solitude is not doing nothing. They are incubating. The unconscious is rearranging symbols, generating connections, and preparing insights. This incubation period is essential for creativity. Modern culture often glorifies constant activity and output, but true innovation requires downtime. Staying at home, resting in stillness, provides the incubation that later bursts forth as creative insight. Dreams as creative catalysts. Dreams are one of the richest sources of creativity, and they flourish in solitude. Jung himself drew heavily from his dreams to develop psychological concepts. Many artists, scientists, and writers have credited dreams with breakthroughs. For example, Paul McCartney famously heard the melody of Yesterday in a dream. Dmitri Mendeleev visualized the periodic table in a dream. By staying at home and prioritizing rest, individuals create the conditions for such dreams to emerge. Recording dreams upon waking, reflecting on their imagery, and engaging with their symbols transforms them into creative catalysts. Active imagination and home creativity. Active imagination, Jung's technique of dialoguing with unconscious figures, is inherently creative. It produces stories, images, and even entire worlds. Practiced at home, it becomes a form of creative discipline. The individual sits quietly, invites an image to arise, and then interacts with it, perhaps drawing, painting, or writing what unfolds. Over time, this becomes a rich well of creative material. Unlike productivity-driven creativity, which seeks external approval, active imagination yields authenticity. It is creativity as self-expression, as individuation, as symbolic communication between the ego and the self. Home is the laboratory where this experiment unfolds. The role of boredom in creativity. Modern society treats boredom as a problem to be eliminated with constant entertainment. Yet, Jung might argue that boredom is a gateway to creativity. In solitude at home, when distractions run out, boredom emerges, but if tolerated, boredom gives way to imagination. The psyche, desperate for stimulation, begins to create its own images and narratives. Children exemplify this. Left alone without toys, they invent games out of sticks, stories out of shadows, entire worlds out of imagination. Adults, too, rediscover creativity when they endure boredom without fleeing into distraction. Thus, staying home and enduring boredom is not wasted time. It is fertile ground. Collective withdrawal and cultural creativity. Periods when large groups of people are forced to stay home, wars, pandemics, or social upheavals, often coincide with cultural bursts of creativity. Writers pen novels, musicians compose songs, and philosophers develop ideas in seclusion. Jung would see this as the collective unconscious reorganizing itself. When the collective withdraws, the energy usually spent outwardly is redirected inward. The result is new myths, new symbols, and new art. On an individual level, the same principle applies. By withdrawing home, one reclaims energy and redirects it inward. The result may be a painting, a poem, or simply a new understanding of oneself. All are forms of creativity. The healing power of creative solitude. Creativity in solitude is not only productive, but also healing. Jung observed that patients who engaged in creative expression, drawing mandalas, sculpting figures, painting dreams, often experience psychological relief. The act of making visible what was hidden allowed integration of unconscious material. At home in stillness, individuals can engage in similar healing creativity. Even simple acts like journaling, sketching, or rearranging furniture symbolically express unconscious needs. Each creative gesture heals, integrates, and strengthens the psyche. Part 8. Balancing solitude and social connection. Carl Jung never advocated for absolute withdrawal from the world. While he emphasized the transformative power of solitude, he also recognized that individuation requires dialogue with others. The psyche is not an isolated island. It develops in the tension between inner and outer, between solitude and connection. To prefer staying at home may be psychologically healthy when it nurtures authenticity, but it must be balanced with engagement in the social world. True wholeness emerges when solitude and connection complement each other rather than cancel each other out. The dual polarity of introversion and extraversion. Jung's model of psychological types places introversion and extraversion as two poles of psychic orientation. Introverts draw energy from within, extroverts from without. Yet Jung was careful to stress that no one is purely one or the other. Every individual requires both inward reflection and outward engagement. To live entirely in solitude is as unbalanced as to live entirely in social performance. Staying at home addresses the introverted pole. It replenishes energy, fosters creativity, and allows shadow integration, but connection with others addresses the extroverted pole. It challenges the ego, offers feedback, and grounds insights in reality. The key to individuation is balance, oscillating between solitude and connection as the psyche requires. Solitude without connection. The risk of regression. When solitude becomes absolute isolation, the psyche risks regression. The individual may become trapped in repetitive thoughts, disconnected from reality, or engulfed by unconscious material. Jung saw this danger clearly in some patients who withdrew excessively. Instead of achieving individuation, they collapsed into neurosis. The home, when overemphasized, can become a prison. What was once a sanctuary turns into confinement. Without contact with others, the ego loses perspective. The individual may mistake fantasies for reality, or inflate themselves with grandiose ideas, unchecked by dialogue. Thus, connection with society is necessary as a grounding force. Connection without solitude, the risk of dissolution. On the other hand, those who avoid solitude dissolve into the collective. They live entirely in persona, performing for others without ever discovering the self. Their energy scatters outward, leaving them drained and hollow. Jung describes such people as mass men, defined not by individuality, but by conformity. Without solitude, they never meet the shadow, never listen to the unconscious, and never develop authenticity. They may appear successful socially, but psychologically they remain shallow. Connection without solitude is as destructive as solitude without connection. Dialogue as the bridge between inner and outer. Jung emphasized that individuation requires dialogue, both inner dialogue with unconscious figures and outer dialogue with real people. The insights gained in solitude must be tested in relationship, while the challenges of relationship must be processed in solitude. This oscillation forms the rhythm of psychological growth. For example, an individual may discover through solitude that they have repressed anger, but until they engage in conversation with others, expressing this anger constructively, the insight remains abstract. Conversely, a conflict in relationship may reveal hidden complexes that only solitude can unpack. The balance of solitude and connection creates a feedback loop essential for individuation. Archetypal symbolism of community and home. Archetypally, the home symbolizes the self, while the community symbolizes the collective unconscious. Both are necessary. The hero in myth does not remain forever in the hut or cave. They return to the village with the boon, sharing what they have discovered. To stay home permanently is to refuse the hero's journey. To never return home is to lose oneself in endless wandering. Individuation mirrors this archetypal pattern. Retreat into solitude, return to community, repeat. The social function of the persona. Though Jung warned against over-identifying with the persona, he did not suggest discarding it entirely. The persona has a social function. It allows smooth interaction and protects the inner life from exposure. The goal is not to live without a persona, but to wear it lightly. Time at home ensures the persona does not dominate, while time in society ensures the persona remains functional. Balance emerges when one can move between mask and authenticity fluidly. Solitude as preparation for authentic connection. One of the greatest benefits of solitude is that it purifies social connection. Individuals who have faced their shadow and cultivated an inner life approach others with less projection. They no longer demand that partners or friends carry their unmet needs. Instead, they relate authentically, offering presence rather than dependency. Thus, staying at home is not antisocial. It is pre-social. It prepares the individual to connect from a place of wholeness rather than fragmentation. In this way, solitude strengthens community rather than undermining it. Case study: the balance in Jung's life. Jung himself embodied this balance. He withdrew to Bowling Tower for solitude, yet he also maintained a rich social life as a physician, lecturer, and mentor. His solitude gave depth to his insights. His social connections grounded them in practice. Without solitude, his psychology would lack originality. Without connection, it would lack application. His life illustrates that individuation requires both poles in tension. The collective crisis of imbalance. Modern culture struggles with this balance. In hyper-connected societies, solitude is stigmatized, leaving individuals drained by constant interaction. In other contexts, such as during global crises or pandemics, forced solitude isolates people excessively, leading to despair. Both extremes highlight the necessity of conscious balance. Jung would argue that humanity must learn to value solitude as much as connection, integrating both into daily rhythms. Toward a rhythm of wholeness. The psyche thrives not in extremes, but in rhythm. Just as breath requires inhalation and exhalation, individuation requires solitude and connection. Staying at home is the inhalation, drawing inward, gathering energy, listening to the self. Social engagement is the exhalation, releasing energy, sharing insights, relating to others. Without inhalation, one suffocates. Without exhalation, one bursts. Wholeness lies in the balanced rhythm of both. So the next time you choose the quiet of your home over the noise of the crowd, remember, you are not escaping life. You are entering it more deeply. Jung reminds us that solitude is not a weakness, but a sacred path toward wholeness.